Lion Olamide. And starting with this morning is the Punch newspaper. And on the video news headline, I have said on illegal oil deals. Illegal oil deals. It said federal government fails to recover 69 billion US dollars loot in American banks. Federal government fails to recover 69 billion US dollars loot in American banks. Said 28.3 trillion naira illegal funds remain in Texas banks since firm's discovery in 2019. 28.3 trillion naira illegal funds remain in Texas banks since firm's discovery in 2019. And then SNSA assesses 9 billion US dollars loot can be recovered within 3 months. As the US firm responded, said the SNSA assesses 9 billion US dollars loot can be recovered within 3 months, says US firm. And this service can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then Children's Day celebration. I have Buhari hosts children. Federal government launches 40 million safety kits. Buhari hosts children, and then the federal government launches 40 million safety kits. That's on page 25 of the Punch newspaper, and then they have the picture story of how the celebration went yesterday. And then still on the Punch newspaper, I said, I prayed for my son on phone. I prayed for my son on phone. I didn't know he would die the next day. That is coming from the father of NAF man, the late NAF man. Said that is on page 30 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And the federal government lists fresh 132 COVID-19 travel guidelines offender. Federal government lists fresh 132 COVID-19 travel guidelines offenders. Those are the people that don't follow the COVID-19 travel guidelines, so they are wanted by the federal government. And that is on page 36 of the Punch newspaper. And then on page 4, said officers injured as Ogun Curtis land grabbers release clash. Officers injured as Ogun Curtis land grabbers release clash. That's in Ogun State. That story can be found on page 4 of the Punch newspaper. And then still I'm going to page 9. Saraki kicks as para panel recommends as governors orders prosecution. Saraki kicks as para panel recommends as governors orders prosecution, and that's on page 9 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then going to page 4, it says police impound 70 Okadas, the clear fresh clampdown on Lagos errant riders. Police impound 70 Okadas, declares fresh clampdown on Lagos errant riders, and that's on page 4 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then going to page 8 of the Punch newspaper, it said Fire suspend provost over college fumigation crisis. Probe begins. Fire suspend provost over college fumigation crisis, and then the probe begins. That's on page 8. And then still on the Punch, said Naira slips to 490 Naira per dollars at parallel markets. That CBN plans digital currency. That's on page 26. Said Naira slips to 490 Naira per dollars at the parallel market. And the CBN plans digital currency. You can read that on page 26. And then still on page 2, that's on the new election appointments of the new Chief of Army Staff. Said 25 generals, others may go as Yahya Emandi's Chief of Army Staff. Said ex-generals ask new Chief of Army Staff to prioritize anti-terror banditry fight. Ex-generals ask new Chief of Army Staff to prioritize anti-terror and banditry fight. And you can read the stories on page 2 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And then lastly, I have COVID-19 vaccination suffers setback, says federal government laments vaccine shortage. COVID-19 vaccination suffers setback, federal government laments vaccines shortage, and that's on page 9. And then moving to page 8, said NLC reboots government on provocative pro-price proposal, 20 strike, and that story is on page 8. And then still on page 8, that's on the new the fighter jet that is planned to be brought into the country. So National Assembly members in US NAHELP expects this jet July. National Assembly members in US NFA expect 6 jets by July, and that's on page 8 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And that leads us to the Vanguard newspaper this morning. Major news headline, it says 20 generals may go as Buhari names Yahya new chief of army staff. 20 generals may go as Buhari names Yahya new chief of army staff. Said 20 cost 35, 36 generals face instant retirement. 20 cost 35, 36 generals face instant retirement. His appointment from regular cost 37 pushes him above cost 35, 36 officers. And then it says it's the tradition in the military for seniors to bow out when juniors are sent. It is the tradition in the military for seniors to bow out when juniors are sent, and that is coming from a source. And you can read that on page 5 of the Vanguard newspaper. And the next story is that on insecurity. It says SARS disbandment creating vacuum in policing. SARS disbandment creating vacuum in policing. That is coming from the IGP. And then it says suspected IPOB ESN sponsors in custody. And then addition, it said we have arrested 1,166 high-profile persons or terms attackers. We have arrested 1,166 high-profile persons or terms attacker, and that's on page 35 of Vanguard newspaper this morning. And then on Children's Day celebration, said reinforce child rights protection. UNICEF tells Nigeria. Reinforce child rights protection. That is coming from UNICEF to Nigeria. And then you can read that on page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. And then on Kwara assets, said panel indeed Saraki Ahmed others. Panel indeed Saraki Ahmed others. Government claims false diversionary. That is coming from Saraki, and that's on page 9. And then still on the security issue in Nigeria, said Nigeria is in safe hands, and that is coming from Lai Mohammed. Nigeria is in safe hands. And then next week is fresh price. Fresh price will short Nigeria without notice. Will short Nigeria without notice, and that is coming from the Nigerian Labour Congress. And you can read that on page 8, why they want to shut down Nigeria without notice. And then going to page 8, said Amnesty International laments part of killings in Nigeria. Amnesty International laments part of killings in Nigeria, and that is on page 8. Food prices rise in April despite fall in inflation. Food prices rise in April despite fall in inflation, and that is on page 19. Omobateshola Emeko for coronation as 21st Olu of Warri, and that is coming up by August 21st. You can read that story on page 12 of the Vanguard newspaper. And then on repairs, Lagos shuts Eko Bridge for 10 weeks. Lagos shuts down Eko Bridge for 10 weeks. And that story is on page 10 of the Vanguard newspaper. And then lastly, on electricity, BPE moves to unbundle TCN. BPE moves to unbundle TCN. And that's it on the Vanguard newspaper this morning. And with that, we move to Daily Sun. And on the major news headline, I have 45 generals to retire as Buhari names Yahya Army Chief. 45 generals to retire as Buhari names Yahya Army Chiefs. Officers of course 35 and 36 most affected. Officers of course is 35, 36 mostly affected. And you can read the story on page 7 of the little newspaper. And then on the constitution review, said Northern governor set up committee on restructuring. Northern governor set up committee on restructuring. Ohaneze insists on power devolution through federalism. Women demand more appointments and representation. Women demand more appointments and representation. How Nigeria can act new constitution, Ekwere Madu. And you can read all the stories on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And the Imo government denies issuing shots on site order, mass arrest. You can read the story on page 27. And then going to page 7 again, that is on open grazing ban. It says Miyetti Allah 6 meeting with governors, other leaders. Miyetti Allah 6 meeting with governors and other leaders. You can read that story on page 7 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And then on COVID-19 report, said don't worsen children's problem with another crisis. UNICEF warns federal government. Said don't worsen children's problem with another crisis. And that is UNICEF warning the federal government. And you can read that on page 3 of the Little newspaper this morning. And then I have Nigeria on the brink, says Yoruba elders. Nigeria on the brink, says Yoruba elders. And that story is on page 8 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And the police arrest attackers of autumn convoy. Police arrest attackers of autumn convoy. As force claim recovery of 5,000 weapons from secessionists. As force claim recovery of 5,000 weapons from secessionists and bandits. IGP says SARS disbandment creating vacuum. And all these stories are on page 4 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And then immigration ramps up production to beat deadline for passport backlogs. Immigration ramps up production to beat deadline for passport backlog. And that's on page 7 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And that takes us to Nigerian Tribune. And on the major news headline, I have non-state actors bent on frustrating democracy. Non-state actors bent on frustrating democracy. And that is coming from NSA. Said 11 offices, 1,105 ballot boxes, 694 voting cubicles, 429 generating sets lost to attack in 4 weeks. And that is coming from the INEC boss. And you can read that story on page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And that's still on SARS disbandment. Said SARS disbandment created vacuum in fight against insecurity. SARS disbandment created vacuum in fight against insecurity. And that is coming from the IGP. It says over 3,700 reinforcements sent to Southeast, South-South. Over 3,700 reinforcements sent to Southeast, South-South. And the 1,176 high-profile criminals arrested from April 7th. 1,176 high-profile criminals arrested from April 7th. And that story is on page 26 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Said don't bring Sharia to Southwest. Don't bring Sharia to Southwest. PFM won Senate. And that story is on page 26 also. You can read that. And then Major General Farouk Yahya is new chief of Army Staff. Major General Farouk Yahya is new chief of Army Staff. And that story is on page 30 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And the rights violation, that is on rights violation, it says Amnesty International indicts Gowon, OBJ, IBB, Jonathan, Buhari. Amnesty International indicts Gowon, OBJ, IBB, Jonathan, and Buhari. And you can read that story on page 27 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And then I go to page 26. It said Reps query Accountant General over illegal withdrawals from recovered loot. Reps query Accountant General over illegal withdrawals from recovered loot, and that is on page 26. And it said how federal government will finance 30 trillion US dollars infrastructural gap. Finance Minister. How federal government will finance 30 trillion US dollars infrastructure gap. That is coming from the Finance Minister. And then to find out how, you can go to page 7 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then going to page 6, it said NNPC recorded 39.8 billion naira trading surplus in February. NNPC recorded 39.8 billion naira trading surplus in February, and that is on page 6. And then still on page 6, said 4 states given 7.4 billion naira for land cultivation, and that is coming from CBN. You can read that on page 6. And still on the Constitution Review, said Constitution Review will not address Nigeria's problem, and that is coming from Afenifere, that the Constitution reviewing of the Constitution will not solve the Nigerians' problem. And to find out why the reviewing of the Constitution will not solve the Nigerians' problem, you can read the story on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then lastly, Olanipekun backs Akeredolu, says 1999 Constitution is a fiction. Olanipekun backed Akeredolu, says 1999 Constitution is a fiction. We are for new Constitution, Falana and Adesina. Geopolitical zones should have separate constitutions, and that is coming from Ezekome. And all these are on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And that leads us to the Nation newspaper. And on the major news headline, I have hashtag EndSARS, says how hashtag EndSARS protests weakened police by IGP. How hashtag EndSARS protests weakened police by IGP. States already running local police. Operation Restore Peace yielding results. Operation Restore Peace yielding results. And that story is on page 4 of the Nation newspaper this morning. And then said legislative, judiciary, financial autonomy set for take off. Legislative, judicial, financial autonomy set for take off. Presidency, governors, unions reach agreement. Now you can read that also on page 4 of the Nation newspaper this morning. Theater Commander Major General Yahaya is new army chief. Theater Commander Major General Yahaya is new army chief, and that is also on page 4. 41 INEC officers destroyed in 14 states, says chairman. 41 INEC offices destroyed in 14 states, says chairman, and that is also on page 4 of the Nation newspaper this morning. And then going to page 3, says South demands more derivation cash. South demands more derivation cash. Afenifere snubs hearing, and that is on page 3. And then I move to page 2. Say Kwara government Saraki bickers over sales of state assets. Kwara government Saraki bickers over sales of state assets, and that is on page 2. And then 26 bodies recovered in ferry accident. 26 bodies recovered in ferry accident, and that is on page 9, page 8 this morning on the Nation newspaper. And with that, we move to the Guardian newspaper this morning. The major news headline says fear of massive retirement grips officers as army gets new chief. Fear of massive retirement grips officers as army gets new chief. Says Nigeria could lose over 30 generals in 4 months. Nigeria could lose over 30 generals in 4 months. Geofueling tension, ethnic distrust, YCE, Southeast Group blast president. And the Buhari appoints Mohammed as native DG, Abari NDA DG. And that story is on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then Nigerians to pay more for imported vehicles from June. Nigerians to pay more for imported vehicles from June. And that story is on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. Fresh concerns greet planned privatization of TCN. Fresh concerns great planned privatization of TCN. And that story is on page 15 of the Guardian newspaper this morning. We are targeting more 3 million children for free feeding, says Buhari. We are targeting 3 million more children for free feeding. And that is coming from President Buhari. And that story is on page 3. And still on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper, it says SARS disbandment creating security challenge, IGP cries out. SARS disbandment creating security challenge, IGP cries. And that is on page 3. And then I move to page 4. Said federal government warns corporates of as INEC records 41 attack on facilities. Federal government warns corporates as INEC records 41 attack on facilities. And that is on page 4. And finally, still on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper, it says how AGF illegally transferred 59 billion naira from EFCC accounts. How AGF illegally transferred 59 billion naira from EFCC accounts. And that takes us to the Daily Trust newspaper this morning. Another major news headline says retirement dangles on 30 generals as Buhari appoints Yahya as chief of army staffs. Retirement dangles on 30 generals as Buhari appoints Yahya as chief of army staffs. Experts, APC sets agenda for new army chief. Experts, APC sets agenda for new army chief. He won't disappoint Nigerians. That is coming from Kingsmen. And this story is on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper this morning. And then they have the pictorial story of how the Children's Day celebration went. And then I have a picture of a girl at the farm in Abuja during the Children's Day celebration yesterday. And then children celebrating that day with President Muhammadu Buhari at the presidential villa. And then Governor Babajide Sanwo-Olu salutes the Boy Scouts during the Children's Day celebration in Lagos yesterday. And then still on the Children's Day celebration, say federal government launches child safety protection initiative. Federal government launches child safety protection initiative. And that is on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Fulani suffering greater AIDS in Nigeria, Macban. Fulani suffering greater AIDS in Nigeria, Macban, and that is on page 12. And then on page 8 said US to federal government give electoral access to people living with disabilities. Give electoral access to people living with disabilities. And that is on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper this morning. And the 41 INEC facilities attacked in 2 years, says Yakubu. 41 INEC facilities attacked in 2 years, and that is coming from Yakubu, and still on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And the Usoma Dam, Abuja water source faces contamination threat. Abuja water source faces contamination threat, and that is on page 34. And then I move to the Constitution Review. Said stakeholders demand more states, 25% derivation, and others. Stakeholders demand more states, 25% derivation, others, and that is on page 32 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Kebbi boat tragedy, 46 corpses recovered. 46 corpses recovered, and that is on the Kebbi boat tragedy, and that's on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper this morning. And with that, we move to New Telegraph. And on the major news headline, it says investigation. Over 20 senior military officers may go. Over 20 senior military officers may go as Buhari appoints Major General Yahaya as Army Chief. 22nd Chief of Army Staff set for operational strategic tactical reorganization. Profile of the new Chief of Army Staff, and that is on page 2 of the New Telegraph newspaper. And then I have 300% pro hike. So 300% pro hike. NLC vows to cripple economy nationwide. Says no current negotiation with federal government on price increase. Threatens to reactivate suspended Kaduna strike. And that is on page 3 of the New Telegraph newspaper this morning. And then on the state of our health, says still climbing boosts outpatient health. Still climbing boosts outpatient health. And that is on page 28 of the New Telegraph newspaper this month. So you can go there to read and find out how still climbing can boost people with heart problems health. And then going by still on the New Telegraph newspaper this morning, said cassava, Nigeria to save $580 million from CBN's initiative. Nigeria to save $580 million from CBN's initiative. And then IGP talking here, he said, we are going after IPOB, ESN leaders, financiers, and that is on page 6. Don't bring Sharia to Southwest, PFN tells Senate. Don't bring Sharia to Southwest, PFN tells Senate, and that is on page 3 of the New Telegraph newspaper this morning. And still on the constitutional review, it said Ohaneze, South seek restructuring orders. Ohaneze, South seek restructuring orders, and that is on page 4 of the New Telegraph newspaper this morning. And the final is Sanwo-Olu. Lagosians will witness more people-oriented projects in 24 months. Lagosians will witness more people-oriented projects in 24 months, and that is on page 8 of the New Telegraph newspaper this morning. And lastly, I have the This Day newspaper. And on the major news headline, it says jubilations in Maiduguri as Yahaya emerges new army chief. Jubilations in Maiduguri as Yahaya emerges new army chief. Says several generals may retire. Several generals may retire. And this story is on page 48 of This Day newspaper. Buhari pledges better nation for future generation. Buhari pledges better nation for the future generation, and that is on page 5 of This Day newspaper. And then I have IG, agitation for state police unnecessary. Agitation for state police unnecessary, says 1,166 suspects arrested in Southeast, South. And then NERC to enforce compensation for undersupplied electricity customers. NERC to enforce compensation for undersupplied electricity customers, and that story is on page 6. And then Emefiele, he said 35 trillion naira infrastructure investments needed for double-digit growth. 35 trillion naira infrastructure investments needed for double-digit growth. Say urges governors to make state economy viable. And the federal government to screen project for PPP suitability, and that is on page 48. And with that, we've come to the end of the Gallery TV news update newspaper review this morning. Don't forget to join us by 12 p.m. for yet another news update. I am Titilayo Olamide. Thanks for watching and do enjoy today.